If you Google about the Mediterranean Sea migration routes, there is a good chance you'll see this.
No, sit down.
Thousands of people fleeing war, persecution and violence in a desperate bid to reach Europe. These massive migration flows have slowly and painfully transformed the Mediterranean Sea into a border where human suffering prevails.
Borders have different forms of barriers. Some are physical barriers like walls and fences. Sometimes there are natural barriers like the sea itself or a desert. But borders are much more than physical barriers. So there are legal forces operating on the borders, political ones, military means. So there is a kind of complex architecture moving around borders, right? And people crossing borders in a way interact with all this multi-level dimension of borders.
Concerning those people crossing the Mediterranean Sea through dangerous migration routes, they have to interact with all this multi-level dimension of borders. And they are also confronted with government's willingness to set aside their rights and freedoms, even in times of pandemic.
During the COVID-19 pandemic, humanitarian needs overall somehow rose a lot. So they went up for about 40% according to UN estimates during 2020 and also during 2021. We really see that the pandemic affected mostly people that are poor, people that are living in conflict zones, and also people that are on the move, meaning people that are moving or were forced to move from their countries to other places.
We all know that the pandemic has posed challenges for governments and societies. But for those people on the move seeking asylum in Europe, it means one more chapter in the long story of inequality, dominance and exclusion at the European borders. Perhaps this story is mainly driven by what is called national security narratives.
National security narratives are not new to international relations or global politics. These kind of narratives are very common in past history, and they are always a resource for politicians when they want to push for some more communitarian form of politics, when they want to gather support inside the country for more defensive policies or some more contained ways of conceiving international relations. What we are seeing in the last decade in Europe, I think, is an answer to more embracing and broader challenge by the international system, the political system and the economic system.
The effects of national security narratives became, therefore, a justification for more policies of exclusion, and this introduced a sort of hierarchy of mobility for those vulnerable groups of people on the move.
So this idea of distinguishing and creating hierarchies of mobility has been always implemented on the borders, and that is particularly true also today with the current European policies.
The hierarchy of mobility best represents the ruthless pushback policy carried out by the European authorities in the Mediterranean Sea, which became the most disturbing policy in Europe. The security policy plays a central role in exacerbating suffering at high sea, with migration flows getting stronger, more frequent, and more deadly. Much of this crackdown has been at the hands of Frontex, the European agency tasked with border control issues. Under the so-called pushback policy, many overcrowded boats caught by Frontex or its allies were sent back to their places of departure, without identification of those in need of assistance, such as the sick, injured, pregnant women, and children. By putting this policy into practice, The Frontex treats border crossers like criminals. For many, this is not only a violation of rights and freedoms, but also a clear demonstration of a populist anti-migrant policy that puts our democracy at risk.
That for a lot of politicians, especially what we call populist politicians, this is a very welcome crisis. This is exactly the excuse you have to go against, not the migrants, but against democracy as we understand democracy.
Europe cannot just hope that it's going to thrive as a prosperous place when there are still so many problems and violations that have not been properly addressed. According to the International Organization for Migration, around 1,400 people drowned in the Mediterranean Sea only during the first 10 months of 2021. So we are at a real inflection point. If we do not discuss more about the situation, we may lose our voice to pressure the governments to manage the migration flows in a human way. And that is where journalism might play an important role.
First of all, it's important to understand the role of journalism in general and the role of international journalism in terms of giving to people, as a major sources, as the raw material for them to discuss, for them to know whatever is happening. So we tend to think of ourselves in terms of international journalists as being gatekeepers. We are the ones, editors, journalists, reporters, correspondents, we are the ones that decide that there is a crisis, and this crisis in Mediterranean or in Africa or in Latin America is the most important topic for you to know and to discuss in the social media. Journalism is still a source of primary information with credibility, and this is part of what we call democracy. Without information, reliable information, there is no democracy.
But after being confronted with the raw material and information provided by journalism about the situation in the Mediterranean Sea, some activist groups felt like if they want to change the situation and save lives at the high sea, they could not just sit down and wait. They had to do something about it. They became, therefore, the new actors on the scene, transforming the Mediterranean into a political space of resistance.
In response to that, many refugees needing assistance, needing help, needing to be rescued, and also because of the lack of an adequate political answer to that, we see new actors on the scene, new humanitarian actors, and that's something I observe, are much more open and towards these kinds of political statements.
One of the new actors on the scene is the Sea Watch, a non-profit organization that conducts civil search and rescue operations in the central Mediterranean Sea. This organization has grown up in size and scope throughout the years. Today, Sea Watch has 2 rescue ships and 2 aircrafts. But it wasn't like this in the beginning, back in 2015.
They actually started with a quite small boat that was mainly there to monitor the situation. So at the beginning, it wasn't even about rescuing people. It was just about monitoring, being the eye on the central Mediterranean and just documenting what is happening there and getting an own impression of what's happening there, because there was basically no one there to witness what is going on. So that was actually the goal at the beginning, to just watch. And then when the people of Sea-Watch at the beginning realized, okay, we need to do something because people are drowning and no one is there to help them, that's when it became something bigger, and the first rescue mission started as well. And nowadays we are also operating 2 airplanes who monitor the situation. So the monitoring and documenting is also a very big part of our work.
Organizations like Sea Watch, which the activities are based on monitoring, rescuing and documenting, attempt to open up debates about borders and barriers, showing that the current European security policies are not just cruel, they're misguided.
And this is nowadays an important part global justice movement. What we are witnessing is that this turn towards global justice is being made up of multiple alliances among movements who fight for justice in different areas of global politics. It can be on environmental matters, environmental action, for gender parity, equality, but also in terms of human rights and refugee rights, migration rights.
As we can see, the European border architecture has been so far more oriented to a securitized environment of national control, limited migration and social closure. This environment started with the creation of security narratives, and it's never diminished over time, once these narratives keep perpetuating the circumstances for the application of anti-migrant policies. And it's precisely by understanding this complex architecture that humanitarian groups came to contest securitized borders through a debate focused on normalizing migration.
They can represent the history of humanity as different waves of migration. So migration is a normal way of global relations, a normal way of performing global relations. And so normalizing migration, normalizing the way people seek refuge or seek other places to live.
The quest for normalizing migration, by assuring the fundamental rights of the people on the move, has been one of the defining faces of humanitarian activist groups on the digital spectrum. Now we live in a world where social media connect all of us, and we have activist groups sharing their message online. These groups saw the opportunity to spread out their message in the online public discourse, building stronger and wider communities, telling untold stories through images, tagging and writing techniques.
Sea-Watch, of course, is a sea rescue organization, so our main goal obviously is to save human lives at sea in the central Mediterranean. But that is like one main goal or main focus of Sea-Watch, but obviously also we do a lot of media work, and we also aim to be part of the public discourse about topics like migration, sea rescue, or European migration policy. And obviously nowadays social media is a big part of that media communication or media public spaces even.
In using the digital tools to show their practical work and disclose their political demands, activist groups like Sea-Watch tend to become more visible and active in the social and political fields.
Because it's quite remarkable that we see more of this digital activism happening in the sector, in the humanitarian sector. Because activism, that's also already something highly political, and it's a way to express really also dissatisfaction, to pose demands to political institutions, for example, and also to highlight injustices and so on. So this can be highly political content.
Digital activism is suitable when it comes to transforming the Mediterranean into a political space. The political content created by this form of activism not only shows us that Europe helped to cause the migration problem, it shows that Europe's not even paying the debt, providing no protection of those in distress at high sea. For all the European exploitation in Africa that has gone on for so many years, today the European countries close their eyes to what is happening in the Mediterranean Sea.
What I think digital platforms can have a very important role is in this articulation, in the articulation of different movements in terms of global justice. So it's a new resource, of course, it's a more expedient resource, and I think it makes the need for the articulation between or among many movements even more urgent and more feasible. So through social media, I think we are more aware, and we can make other people more aware of the need to articulate different struggles in one big global social justice movement.
Speaking of awareness, thanks to digital platforms, the younger generations became more aware of what is happening around the world, especially about the situations of human suffering during the pandemic, such as the Mediterranean one.
Also, if you look at younger generations, of course, social media is the place to turn to, and what we also saw during the pandemic, that more and more people are turning to online resources, and even events would take place online. So yeah, I guess it's just a very important space to also bring your ideas and messages to.
According to the data provided by the Sea-Watch, this organization has more followers on Facebook than any other social media platform. They have currently more than 280,000 followers. Before the pandemic, Sea-Watch had less than 200,000 followers. And only during the first 18 months after the outbreak of the pandemic in Europe, Sea-Watch noticed a jump in new followers on Facebook, gaining around 60,000 new followers. An average of more than 3,000 new followers per month and more than 100 per day. And the numbers did not only increase in terms of new followers on social media platforms, but also in terms of donations.
I think it was actually that we got more reach, because obviously people spend more time at home, more time on their phones, in social media, on such social media platforms. So yeah, of course there was more awareness also for those kind of topics, and even on other aspects, like for example fundraising, where we were actually quite worried that with people losing their jobs, maybe not having that much money, that they wouldn't be able to donate and support us as much. But actually it even increased, so it even got better, and people maybe had just more time to inform themselves about such topics, and maybe even got more empathetic because of the pandemic. I don't know, that's just a guess.
Promoting more online engagement, more awareness and empathy from the audience is definitely important for the humanitarian cause. However, in a more academic and critical analysis, political change will occur if we, as society, started moving beyond the established nexus between mobility and crisis.
We have to move beyond the idea of a nexus, in between mobility and humanitarian crisis. So if we continue to think of mobility and migration in terms of emergency and crisis, what we will produce is not activism oriented towards political change and legal reforms, but rather forms of compassion and solidarity that are very contingent. So they are still expression of a profound humanity very often, but they are contingent to specific event or specific episodes and so on. So it is difficult to move from that level to a more radical form of political change if we remain confined within the idea of a humanitarian crisis.
If we did not detach mobility from narratives of crisis and emergency, we would never transform the Mediterranean Sea into a space for political change. As long as we continue to treat the migration flows just as the humanitarian crisis that needs emergency measures and security response, it will be only more of a burden of NGOs to fight against the violent anti-migrant policies all alone.
Of course, we have to be aware that there are organizations, activists, volunteers, and even state bodies that conduct rescue operations every day, and they help a lot of border crossers and so on. But all this takes place within a logic of humanitarian emergency. And in that sense, this creates an idea for exceptional norms and exceptional, behavior rather than for discourses about legal rights, political change, and so on. So what we need to do is exactly to separate the idea of borders and, in a way, mobility more broadly from a narrative of humanitarian crisis and contingency.
The debate over migration flows should be less oriented to the idea of supporting the traditional narratives of crisis, and more oriented to the idea of reassuring border crossers their rights to move. There has been a great deal of solidarity and charity, but the migration problem in the Mediterranean Sea is a structural one. And as long as we consider this issue merely as a crisis, we are reinforcing the narrative that caring about human rights is only the job of NGOs and their donors. Caring about human rights is actually the job of all of us who live in democratic societies. And to care about it, we have to look at the Mediterranean Sea beyond the locus of crisis and consider the border crosses as an agency longing for liberty and rights, not at the mercy of security policies. One of the things that could make this possible in our society is education.
I believe that you change when you deal with formation, which is another word for education. So if you want any kind of change in journalism, in activism, and the people's attitude to migration, you have to deal when they are very young at school and try to think of media literacy, to show them the importance of migration in history, to try to fight racism, because the problem of migration is not only migration of immigrants or someone coming to my country and taking my job. This has to do with a systematic racism of prejudice against outsiders.
Europe needs to have systems in place to establish a secure border. But all these violent policies on migrants have been justified under the nexus mobility and crisis, while the activist groups are risking themselves every day to rescuing people at the high sea. To change the situation, more attention should be paid on rights and responsibilities. Education would be then necessary, so a public space for online and offline political participation would be open, calling for long-term strategies. After all, Europe is also a place for immigrants. If these people are risking their lives to take dangerous migration routes in the attempt to apply for asylum, Europe ought to at least provide safe passage and look over their application.